She took the blame for his crimes when he ran away. But years later, the police knock on his door. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The city buzzed with life, yet in the quiet suburbs, the streets lay silent. The wind howled through the empty lanes, carrying whispers of the past, secrets buried under time. Inside an upscale apartment on the 11th floor, Matthew Reed was pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The warm amber liquid swirled in his glass as he took a slow sip, savoring the burn. His life was perfect now, better than he could have ever imagined. A stable job, a luxurious home, and a beautiful fiancée who was sleeping peacefully in the next room. He had left the past behind, or so he thought. A knock at the door shattered the silence. It was late, too late for a visitor. Matthew frowned, placing his glass down on the kitchen counter. He moved towards the door, his heartbeat picking up an unfamiliar rhythm. Something about that knock, it wasn't just a casual tap. It was deliberate, firm, knowing. He hesitated before opening it. And when he did, the air was sucked from his lungs. Nina. She stood there, cloaked in the dim light of the hallway, the shadows painting her in an eerie glow. Her face was the same yet different, the same piercing eyes but colder, the same lips but now void of warmth. Her hair was slightly longer, a few strands falling into her face. She looked like a ghost, an echo from a past he had desperately tried to forget. Matthew's first instinct was to slam the door. His second was to run, but neither was an option. His body refused to move, and Nina took that moment of hesitation to step inside, brushing past him with an unsettling grace. "I thought you were dead," he finally breathed, barely above a whisper. Nina turned to face him, a smirk curling on her lips. "You wish." His mind raced. "How? Why now? After all these years?" "You shouldn't be here," he said, trying to steady his voice. She tilted her head, studying him. "And yet, here I am." Matthew ran a hand through his hair. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Nina, I don't know what you want, but I moved on. Whatever you're looking for, I can't give it to you." She laughed. A slow, humorless laugh. "Moved on." She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "You mean you buried me? Pretended I didn't exist?" He clenched his jaw. "You took the fall, Nina. You knew what that meant." Her smile disappeared. "I knew what it meant for you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small recording device, placing it on the coffee table. "And I also know you don't sleep well at night." Matthew stared at the device. It was old, slightly worn, but he recognized it immediately. A rush of memories hit him like a freight train. "No," he whispered. She nodded. "Yes." He took a step back. His palms turned clammy. "Where did you get that?" Nina crossed her arms. "You don't remember our last conversation before my arrest? You were careless, Matthew. You said too much." She tapped the device. "And I recorded every word." His world tilted. He had been so sure, so certain that everything had been erased, destroyed, that there were no loose ends. But he had been wrong. His past wasn't just knocking. It had let itself in and was now sitting comfortably in his living room. A silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Nina slowly walked toward the couch, her movements methodical, calculated. She picked up the glass of whiskey he had left on the counter, bringing it to her lips and taking a slow sip. He watched her with wide eyes, helpless, trapped in his own home. She had always been good at controlling the moment, manipulating the pieces on the board. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was his life unraveling before him. "I waited," she finally said, placing the glass down. "Every day in that cell, I waited for you to come forward. I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd find the conscience you never had." Matthew swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. He was paralyzed, gripped by a fear he hadn't felt in years. Nina smirked. But you didn't. You built yourself a new life. Got engaged. Congratulations, by the way. He flinched at the venom in her tone. She knew everything. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Did you ever tell her? About me? About what you did? Matthew exhaled shakily, shaking his head. She doesn't know. Nina clicked her tongue, feigning disappointment. Of course she doesn't. She stepped back, grabbing the recorder from the table and holding it up. But she will soon. Everyone will. His breath hitched. Nina, wait. She gave him a small, knowing smile. Sleep tight, Matthew. With that, she turned on her heel and walked towards the door, leaving him frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. As the door clicked shut behind her, Matthew finally collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The past he had buried was back, and this time there was no escaping it. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Matthew's mind raced, trying to grasp at any possible escape, any way to undo the nightmare unfolding before him. But there was none. Nina's presence alone had shattered the fragile illusion of safety he had built for himself. And that recording, his own damning words, preserved like a curse waiting to be unleashed. I don't believe you, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Nina arched an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. Oh, but you do. She pressed a button on the device, and static filled the room before his own voice bled through. It doesn't matter. She'll take the fall. She always does. Matthew felt the blood drain from his face. The words echoed in his head, a ghost of his own making, more haunting than the woman standing before him. His legs wobbled, and he stumbled back against the couch. What do you want? He asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. Nina tapped her fingers against the table, considering. Closure. Justice. Maybe just to watch you squirm. She leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Did you think I would just disappear? That I'd let you live your perfect little life while I rotted in a cell? Matthew swallowed hard. I didn't have a choice. Nina laughed, cold and bitter. You always had a choice. You just picked the one that left me in the dark. He shook his head. If you want revenge, just get it over with. Turn that in, let them come for me. But don't drag this out. She sighed, shaking her head. Revenge is too simple, Matthew. I want you to feel it. To live in fear the way I did, waiting every day for the walls to close in. She took a step closer, invading his space. The scent of her perfume mixed with the sharp, electric tension between them. Her eyes bored into him, unwavering. I want you to think about it every second of the day, she whispered. To look over your shoulder, to hear every knock at the door as the one that will end it all. Matthew's throat went dry. This wasn't just about ruining him. This was about dragging him through hell first. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. A slow, deliberate knock that sent an icy wave of terror through Matthew's body. He turned to Nina, panic rising in his throat. What did you do? She only smiled. I made a phone call. The knocking came again, louder this time. Matthew's world was unraveling. The perfect life he had stolen was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His breath came in short gasps as he turned toward the door. The knocking persisted, steady and unforgiving. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, suffocating him. He took a step toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to find some way out. But there was none. Third knock. Then silence. Nina leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with quiet amusement. Aren't you going to answer it? Matthew swallowed hard and hesitantly reached for the knob. his hands trembling. He twisted it open slowly, inch by inch, until the door creaked and revealed what lay beyond. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their expressions unreadable. Their uniforms, their presence, it was all too real, too final. "Matthew Reed?" the taller officer asked, his voice firm but neutral. Matthew swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes, we have some questions for you. May we come in?" He hesitated, casting a quick glance over his shoulder at Nina. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. Her expression remained calm, expectant, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. He turned back to the officers, forcing a weak smile. "Of course." The officers stepped inside, their sharp eyes scanning the room. The air thickened, the tension suffocating. Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he tried to steady himself. "Do you know why we're here, Mr. Reed?" the second officer asked. Matthew's mind raced. He could deny everything, play dumb, pretend this was all a misunderstanding. But Nina was still standing there, silent but omnipresent, her very existence a reminder that there was no escape from the truth. I'm not sure," he lied, his voice barely above a whisper. The taller officer nodded slightly before producing a small evidence bag. Inside it was a USB drive. "This was sent to us anonymously," the officer continued. "It contains an audio recording that implicates you in a crime from several years ago." Matthew's breath hitched. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew what it was. His own voice damning him. "It doesn't matter. She'll take the fall. She always does." His vision blurred as he felt the walls closing in. There was no way out, no bargaining, no undoing what had been done. "Would you like to explain this recording, Mr. Reed?" For a moment the world stood still. Then slowly he turned back to Nina. She met his gaze, unblinking, her expression unreadable. But he knew. He knew she had planned this moment down to the second. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Matthew exhaled a shuddering breath, his shoulders sinking under the weight of his past. "I think," he murmured, defeated, "I need a lawyer." Nina smiled. The ghost of his past had finally caught up to him. The air in the apartment was heavy, suffocating. Matthew felt the weight of the officer's presence pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. His world had shrunk to this very moment. Nina's cold gaze, the USB drive in the officer's gloved hand, and the undeniable truth that there was no escape. "I think," he murmured, defeated, "I need a lawyer." Nina's smirk widened just a fraction, her satisfaction barely contained. This was what she had waited for. Not just his arrest, but his unraveling. His slow, torturous realization that his carefully constructed life had been a mere illusion. The taller officer, still holding the evidence bag, gave a small nod. "That would be wise, Mr. Reed." Matthew's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. The officers exchanged a glance before the second one spoke. "We'll need you to come with us for further questioning." A flicker of panic shot through him. "Am I under arrest?" "For now, it's just questioning," the officer replied. But given the contents of this recording, that could change very quickly. Matthew looked over at Nina, his eyes pleading. "Nina, please. You don't have to do this." She tilted her head, feigning contemplation. "No, I don't. But I want to." The venom in her voice stung more than he expected. It wasn't just revenge. This was justice, in the cruelest form possible. One of the officers pulled out a pair of handcuffs, their metallic glint catching the dim apartment light. "Turn around, sir." Matthew hesitated, his feet rooted to the floor. How had it come to this? Just an hour ago, he had been drinking whiskey, basking in the comfort of his home, convinced his past was long buried. Now, cold steel tightened around his wrists. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the apartment, final and absolute. He was escorted toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The hallway outside suddenly felt longer, the air colder. The officers guided him toward the elevator, his every step heavy with the dread of what came next. As they reached the doors, he twisted his head back for one last look at Nina. She stood in the doorway of his apartment, arms crossed, a shadow stretching out behind her. She didn't move, didn't waver, just watched. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really hate me that much?" Nina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then she took a slow step forward, just enough for him to hear her final words before the officers pulled him into the elevator. "I loved you once." The doors slid shut. The precinct was cold, sterile. The interrogation room was worse. A small, windowless box with a single table and 2 chairs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making Matthew's headache even worse. He sat stiffly, his hands still cuffed to the table, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. A detective entered, an older man with tired eyes and a thick folder in his hands. He dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. "Matthew Reed," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "You know why you're here?" Matthew exhaled slowly. "I assume it's about that recording." The detective nodded, flipping open the folder. Inside were documents, reports, evidence stacked against him. "It's damning, I won't lie to you." He looked up, meeting Matthew's eyes. "You want to tell me your side of the story?" Matthew hesitated. What could he even say? That he had been young, desperate. That he never expected Nina to take the fall the way she did. That he had convinced himself she'd be fine. But no words could undo the years she spent in prison. No words could erase the betrayal. He started, then shook his head. "I need my lawyer." The detective sighed but didn't press further. "Fair enough." He closed the folder and stood. "I hope you're ready, Mr. Reed. Because Nina Walker made sure the world knows exactly what you did." As the detective left, Matthew lowered his head to the table, exhaling a shaky breath. He had spent years hiding, running from what he had done. But the past always catches up. And this time there was no escaping it. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.